Have you ever had a tabletop campaign go so horribly awry? What happened? Were your players bored? Did the DM seem disinterested? Was there conflict at the table? Or did something happen that everyone sort of just swept under the rug till the group fell apart? How do you avoid these things? Did you even know that these problems were avoidable? Welcome to another reading from the Tome of Dungeoneering. I'm Justin, and in today's episode, I'm talking about the session before the session, the epic tale before the tale, the mythical and the all-powerful Session Zero. Session Zero should be the most important conversation of the entire campaign. But why? Session Zero is a chance to come together as a potential playgroup and discuss what the next game at your table is going to be like. It's the Dungeon Master's chance to lay out ground rules. It's the players and the DM's chance to discuss what type of game is wanted or what system would make the most fun. It is a chance for the group to set boundaries and limits. Session Zeros are vital to setting the standards for your campaign. So much so that the titan of the tabletop role-playing games market, Dungeons & Dragons, officially codified the Session Zero in their November 2021 book, Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Now, if you spend any amount of time with me, you'll eventually hear my spiel that tabletop gaming is a deeply intimate experience, which is always greeted with incredulous looks, but it's true. You and a few other people that you may or may not be very close to have come together to spend on average 4 hours at a table every 2 weeks to tell a story that it could take years to finish telling. The last thing anybody wants to do is get 6 months in and realize they are having a bad time. This can be avoided by having a Session Zero. That is why it is so important to tabletop gaming. Not having Session Zero is like going on a road trip with no gas in the car. In a lot of ways, this tabletop podcast, or at the very least this episode, is actually going to be a relationship advice episode. And just like a relationship, many of the issues that could come up stem from a lack of communication. If we as a community can promise that we will agree to listen and speak earnestly and often, we would be able to avoid some of the largest pitfalls of being at the table. I always start Session Zero with my DM disclaimer. I want my players to know that if they are not having fun for any reason, that they are welcome to come to me and we will find a solution. I also use this as a chance to put forth my hard limits, as Session Zero is where you get everyone on the same page when it comes to those boundaries. These are the things that I do not allow at my table, period. For me, this includes things like heinous forms of assault, you know what I'm talking about, players owning slaves, and that we will cut to black for steamy romantic scenes. I don't care how eloquent you are. I do not need a description of what you do with the bar staff, especially if I'm the one playing said bar staff. Next, I always open up the floor to the players to talk about their limits or their triggers, or at least publicly about the ones they're comfortable sharing. This is important to figure out early. You don't want to spend your entire Session Zero planning an extreme survival campaign in the Arctic, only to find out that one of your players has past trauma around frostbite and frozen corpses. If you have a phobia such as spiders or enclosed spaces, this is the time to voice it to your DM, privately if you prefer. It's just best to figure out these things early. I also invite players to come to me in private. And I let them know that if they're not comfortable making it public, that I will communicate it to the group anonymously as if it is coming from me. So, do you remember that time in school when you were taught how to communicate effectively? Yeah, neither do I. So, how do you have a conversation about hard topics with friends, family, and probably some strangers? At its core, listen, validate, empathize, and then respond. If your player says, "I'd prefer not to have frostbite in our Arctic survival campaign, but I still want to have an Arctic survival campaign," you as the DM can respond with, "No problem. Let's work out what I should avoid in the campaign. Rather than describing the effects of frostbite, what if I just say that you're taking extreme cold damage? Would that work?" And just like that, you now have a dialogue and can move the player group forward. For me, the hardest part for the longest time was starting the discussion. And to help myself with that, I use a consent checklist. For a long time, I used the checklist provided by the fantastic book, Consent in Gaming. But in recent years, I have modified it a bit and tailored it to fit my playstyle. The concept, however, is the same. And any of the checklists that are out there, and there's plenty, it's a plentiful concept, the concept is the same. And any of the checklists out there will serve as a wonderful gateway to this discussion. In early November, we will be having a deep dive into the concepts of consent, such as using the consent checklist and X-carding, in our first roundtable episode featuring Ellie Collins from Atlanta by Night and Sean K. Reynolds from Monty Cook Games, one of the authors of the aforementioned Consent in Gaming book. In short, consent is about finding out what things your players are or are not comfortable being exposed to. Certain types of death, romantic relationships, various types of horror, and even physical or mental damage may be good for some players, but panic attack inducing for others. All of this and more is covered in a good consent checklist. Okay. Deep breath. So, that was all very heavy, very important. But what else should happen during a session 0 once you get all of those things out of the way? This game can cover many different eras, genres, moods, and themes. Session 0 is a fantastic time to discuss what you and the players would find fun. Do you want a Game of Thrones-esque political thriller that explores the politics and backstabbings in a single capital city? Do you want a fantasy setting with no magic, or one with lots of magic? Do you want an adventure that spans a globe and saves the entire prime material plane? Or do you want a shorter, regional folktale about undermining a local sheriff that abuses the locals? Any of these could be fun, and these are far from the only options. Figuring out the answer to this question as a group will make it easier for the DM to spend resources on making a game that the players will actually want to engage with. The other thing that you should use a Session 0 for is figuring out party composition and characters. And I don't just mean making sure there's a balance of class archetypes either. Maybe you discover that your players all want to play wizards. Well, now you get to focus your efforts on running a story that wizards would want to engage in. Maybe you and your party are all wizards from Pig's Pimple, School of Magics, and you are trying to acquire a powerful artifact before a rival school does. Or perhaps you're all fighters from the local militia. Your empire has left you to fend for yourselves while they are off at some war overseas over resources. The void left in security by the Empire's army being absent has allowed for crime, bandits, and flail snails to plague the region. Or perhaps you're all fighters from the local militia. Your empire has left you to fend for yourselves while they are at war over resources in far-off lands. The void and security left by the Empire's army being absent has allowed for crime, bandits, and flail snails to plague the region. Damn that crimson tide. In both of these examples, it gives you all a chance to discuss what the ramifications of these choices are. Lack of skill diversity by not having a bard or rogue could lead to perilous situations that would have otherwise been more easily avoided. And making sure that everyone is aware that without a magical healer, they will need to find other ways to bolster their health and defenses. In the same vein, this also helps you as the dungeon master to not abuse your players inadvertently. If you have an all-paladin party, you are going to want to only occasionally throw stealth checks at them. Otherwise, it could become miserable for the players. Moderation is key in those circumstances. So what is left? Rules as written or rule of cool? Session 0 is a great time to discuss how by the book the game will be handled. This will give the table a chance to discuss if it is okay to break immersion to check rules, or if they would rather just play through. What about homebrew? Are there any house rules that need to be considered, like quick potions or stacking advantage? Do you use the fear and stress mechanics that were just introduced in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft? It's good to know these answers early, so that the table can consent and potentially find compromise before the game begins. Now, you've picked a setting, you've chosen characters, discussed limits and triggers, and feel ready to get started. All is going great, that is, until a month later when a player or DM accidentally hits a trigger or causes a disruption that contradicts the things established in Session 0. Now what? I would suggest that you explicitly discuss during Session 0 a social contract that lays out what happens if somebody is abusing the table, even if it's accidentally. I recommend writing it down and keeping them on display near where you play. I print a copy for each player to keep in their character binder. I like for mine to acknowledge that we should always be playing with empathy for others at the table and their needs, but sometimes accidents happen. When someone accidentally offends or makes an error, they should take the initiative to acknowledge the mistake and make it right. In the instance that someone is actively trying to make someone uncomfortable or is ignoring the limits that have been set, the social contract should have some guidelines about how to respond and possible consequences, up to removal from the table. Doing this sets expectations, and it gives all participants at the table a fair understanding of consequence. Now, I want to touch briefly on this next bit. There'll probably be a whole episode, or maybe even a mini bonus episode, to cover it, but I want to touch on it briefly. The act of setting and protecting boundaries is difficult, and at times can be scary, but I want to make my feelings on this clear. If you have ever been made to feel uncomfortable, or your consent at the table has been violated, or your table dismissed you or didn't stand up for you, I am so sorry that happened. I truly hope it never happens again. I hope that DMs and players hearing this can understand that even though this is just a game, people can be hurt by it. Or at the very least, hurt by us not having empathy for the experiences of other people. If these things are happening at your table, please don't just endure it. Don't hesitate to speak up. Grab a friend to help you speak up, or just leave. Playing a tabletop role-playing game, from Pathfinder to D&D to I Roll for Shoes to whatever it might be that you play, should be fun. And if you're not having it and you're uncomfortable, something is very wrong. Please don't endure it. All right, that's it. Thank you for tuning in for another reading from the Tome of Dungeoneering. Now, we have made the consent checklist that I use freely available over at our website, www.inthedungeon.com. You can also find the link for it in the show notes below. I know it has helped at every table I have ever DM'd, and I hope that it helps you too. We are forever thankful to all of our supporters for making this show possible. If you would like to add your name to our show notes, gain access to monthly bonus episodes, and some pretty neat exclusive merchandise, please consider subscribing to our Patreon. And if you don't have the funds to do that, or you're not ready to do that, but you still liked our content, share us with your friends. Share us with your nerdy groups that you play D&D with. Helping to spread the word of this show helps just as much, and you are just as appreciated. Now, when we do have sponsorships, we're going to put their spots at the very end of the episodes. The episodes are short. We encourage you to listen all the way to the end so that it's beneficial to you. You might discover something you didn't know about, and it's beneficial to us as a potential stream of income to help keep making this podcast. So without further ado, please take a moment to listen to this trailer from our good friends over at Nerds Talking. Here it is.
Hello, this is Lafayette.
And I'm Carlos.
From Nerds Talking the Podcast.
That's right.
Where we talk about everything from UFOs, comic books, movies, streaming services, conspiracy theories, ghosts, video games, and more.
Kick-ass.
All on Nerds Talking the Podcast.
You can find us every Friday with new episodes on all digital platforms where you find your favorite podcast, Nerds Talking, the podcast.
Now back to the show.
All right, that was awesome. Thank you, and we will see you on the next page.
Hey, it's an owl bear.